Hey guys, settle in. Dim the lights a little, maybe pull up your favorite blanket. Tonight, we're not exactly going to be recounting a thrilling tale of heroic knights and daring dragons. Nope, tonight we're going to gently meander through the delightful realities of medieval life. You know, the kind of stuff that makes our modern inconveniences, like spotty Wi-Fi, seem like absolute blessings. So just let your mind drift as we explore why, statistically speaking, most of us wouldn't have made it past our toddler years back then. Relax and let the historical discomfort wash over you. All right, so check this. It's, let's say, the year 1150. You wake up in your, well, bed is a generous term. It's probably a straw-filled tick, maybe with a thin, scratchy wool blanket if you're lucky. And by you, I mean if you're not a complete peasant, which statistically, you very likely would be. If you are a peasant, your bed is probably just straw on the floor of the one-room hut you share with your entire family, and maybe a few livestock seeking warmth. Cozy, right? Now let's talk about the air quality in this hypothetical medieval morning. Forget that crisp, clean feeling. The air is thick. It's thick with the smoke from the ever-burning hearth, the only source of heat in cooking, and the general aroma of unwashed bodies, human and animal waste, because plumbing? What's plumbing? And whatever decaying matter happens to be nearby, which, spoiler alert, is probably a lot. Remember, this is a time before widespread sanitation, before anyone really understood germ theory. So the concept of fresh air was quaint at best. Let's assume you've survived the night, which in itself was a bit of a gamble. Did a stray rat decide to nibble on your toes? Were you bitten by fleas or lice? Did the roof leak on you? These were all very real possibilities. Now you need to, well, attend to your morning rituals. And by rituals, I mean finding a secluded spot outside, or perhaps a bucket if you're feeling fancy, because indoor plumbing is still several centuries away for the vast majority of people. It's a communal experience, let's just say, and not in a fun, bonding kind of way. Once that's sorted, it's time for breakfast. If you're a peasant, this might consist of some coarse bread, maybe some watered-down ale, and if you're really fortunate, some cheese or a few vegetables from your small plot of land. Variety is not the spice of medieval life, survival is. If you're nobility, things are a little better. Perhaps some meat, finer bread and wine, but even then, food safety is a crapshoot. There's no refrigeration, so everything is either freshly slaughtered or preserved with copious amounts of salt, which surprisingly isn't great for your blood pressure. Now let's think about your teeth. Did you brush them? Of course not. Toothbrushes, as we know them, didn't exist. Maybe you used a rough cloth or a twig to try and scrape away some of the buildup. So halitosis was less of a social faux pas and more of a universal experience. And toothaches? Oh boy, toothaches. Without modern dentistry, a simple cavity could turn into a life-threatening infection. People just lived with it or died from it. Fun times. So you've had your potentially bacteria-laden breakfast and your breath could curdle milk. What's next? Well, if you're a peasant, it's time to work. And by work, I mean back-breaking labor from dawn till dusk in the fields, regardless of the weather. Planting, harvesting, tending livestock. It's all physically demanding and incredibly repetitive. Injuries were common, and even a small cut could easily become infected and led to serious complications, or even death. Remember, antibiotics are a distant dream. If you're a noble, your day might involve overseeing your lands, perhaps some hunting, which was less about getting food and more about sport and social status, or maybe even some political maneuvering. But even for the privileged, life wasn't exactly a picnic. Disease didn't discriminate based on social standing, and in fact, sometimes the close quarters and lack of sanitation in castles could make the nobility even more susceptible to outbreaks. Plus, there was the constant threat of war, rebellion, and the ever-present risk of being on the wrong side of a political intrigue. Let's float over to the topic of childhood. Childhood in the Middle Ages. Not exactly the carefree, innocent time we like to imagine. Infant mortality rates were terrifyingly high. Diseases that we now consider minor childhood illnesses, measles, chicken pox, even a bad cold, could easily be fatal. And even if a child survived infancy, they were often put to work at a very young age. There was no lengthy period of education and play for most children. They were small adults, contributing to the family's survival as soon as they were able. And speaking of education, literacy was rare, especially among the lower classes. Knowledge was primarily passed down orally, and the vast majority of people lived their entire lives without ever reading or writing. This limited their understanding of the world and made them reliant on the interpretations and pronouncements of the clergy and the nobility. Information traveled slowly, and rumors and superstitions often held more sway than facts. Now let's briefly touch upon hygiene, or rather the distinct lack thereof by our modern standards. Bathing was not a frequent occurrence. Some believe that washing too often could actually make you more susceptible to illness, as it opened up your pores to bad humors. So people went for weeks, even months, without a proper bath. The accumulated grime, sweat, and other things must have been quite something. Imagine the smell in a crowded room. It's enough to make you appreciate your daily shower, isn't it? So you're going about your medieval day unwashed and potentially riddled with parasites. Let's consider the medical care available to you should you happen to fall ill or get injured. Well, for the vast majority, your doctor was likely the local wise woman or barber-surgeon. The wise woman might offer herbal remedies, some of which might have had a little benefit, while others were pure folklore. The barber-surgeon, as the name suggests, was someone who cut hair and also performed basic surgical procedures, often without any anesthesia or understanding of antisepsis. Think bloodletting, pulling teeth, and maybe even attempting to set broken bones. It was a risky business, to say the least, and often more harmful than helpful. If you were wealthy, you might have access to a physician who had likely studied at a university. However, even their understanding of the human body and disease was based on ancient theories, like the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was thought to be caused by an imbalance of these humors, and treatment often involved trying to restore this balance through things like bloodletting, purging, and special diets. Effective treatments were few and far between, and infections were a constant and deadly threat. And then there were the big diseases. The plagues, like the infamous Black Death, could sweep through communities, wiping out huge proportions of the population in a matter of months. There was no understanding of how these diseases spread, so attempts to control them were largely ineffective and often based on superstition or misguided beliefs. Imagine living in constant fear of an invisible killer that could strike your entire family down. It's enough to make you want to douse yourself in hand sanitizer, isn't it? Let's not forget about the charming state of medieval law and justice. Depending on your social status and where you lived, the legal system could be arbitrary and brutal. Trial by ordeal was still a thing in some places. Think holding hot irons or plunging your hand into boiling water to prove your innocence. If you were innocent, supposedly God would intervene. If not, well, you had bigger problems than a burn. Punishments for crimes, even minor ones, could be harsh, ranging from fine and public shaming to imprisonment, torture, and execution. And let's not even get started on the concept of due process. Now, for a little royal interlude. We often have romantic notions of kings and queens living in opulent splendor. And while they certainly had more material comforts than the average peasant, their lives were often far from idyllic. They were constantly navigating political intrigues, power struggles with nobles, and the threat of war. Marriages were often political alliances with little regard for personal feelings, and the pressure to produce heirs was immense. And let's be honest, royal families throughout history have had their fair share of interesting characters. We're talking about vanity, paranoia, and the occasional descent into outright madness, all while wearing very heavy crowns. Take, for example, some of the delightful marriage customs of the time. Royal marriages were all about consolidating power and forging alliances. Love? That was a bonus, if you were lucky. Often, young royal children were betrothed to much older individuals from other kingdoms, whom they had never met. Imagine being a teenager shipped off to a foreign land to marry a stranger simply because it made sense on a political map. And then there was the charming practice of inbreeding, particularly among certain European royal houses, in an attempt to keep power within the family. The results, as you can probably guess, were often less than ideal in terms of the health and stability of the offspring. We'll have a whole other bedtime story on that genealogical roller coaster someday, I promise. Let's float over to the delightful world of medieval travel. If you needed to go anywhere, unless you were wealthy enough to own a horse, you were walking. And medieval roads, if you could even call them that, were often little more than muddy tracks filled with ruts and potentially bandits. Journeys that would take us hours today could take days or even weeks. And the accommodations along the way? Think flea-ridden inns with questionable food and even more questionable company. It's safe to say that a weekend getaway was not really a concept. And what about entertainment? Well, for the peasants, entertainment was often communal and tied to religious festivals or local traditions. Think folk music, dancing, and maybe some rudimentary games. For the nobility, there were feasts, tournaments, and perhaps the occasional traveling minstrel. But even these forms of entertainment could be disrupted by outbreaks of disease or political unrest. Life was often hard and diversions were limited. Let's briefly consider the medieval understanding of the world. Their worldview was heavily influenced by religious teachings and ancient texts, with little room for scientific inquiry as we understand it today. Superstitions were rampant, and natural phenomena that we now understand through science were often attributed to divine intervention or supernatural forces. Eclipses, comets, even bad weather could be seen as omens or signs of God's displeasure. This lack of scientific understanding contributed to fear and uncertainty and made people more vulnerable to manipulation. And speaking of religion, while it provided a sense of community and moral framework for many, it also had its darker sides. Religious intolerance was common, and those who deviated from accepted doctrines could face persecution. The power of the church was immense, and it played a significant role in shaping medieval society, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. So you're navigating your medieval existence, dodging disease, avoiding legal trouble, and trying not to offend anyone important. Let's delve a little deeper into the daily grind, particularly for those who weren't born into nobility. For the vast majority of the population, life was a constant struggle for survival. Food security was precarious. A bad harvest could lead to famine and widespread starvation. And even in good times, malnutrition was common, leaving people weakened and more susceptible to illness. Imagine the sheer physical toll of daily life. Without modern conveniences, everything required manual labor. Hauling water, grinding grain, chopping wood, these were all time-consuming and physically demanding tasks. And the tools they had were often crude and inefficient. It's no wonder that people aged quickly and that life expectancy was so low. By our standards, someone in their 40s or 50s might be considered old. Let's talk about clothing. For most people, clothing was simple, often made from rough, homespun materials. They likely owned very few sets of clothes, which were rarely washed and often infested with lice and fleas. The concept of fashion existed, particularly among the nobility, but even their elaborate garments were often impractical and uncomfortable by our standards. Hygiene wasn't really a consideration in clothing design. Now let's consider the darker aspects of medieval society. Violence was a fact of life. Petty crime was common, and in times of war or unrest, large-scale violence could erupt. There was no reliable police force to maintain order, and personal safety often depended on your ability to defend yourself or your community. Feuds and vendettas could drag on for generations, perpetuating cycles of violence. And then there were the societal hierarchies. Medieval society was rigidly structured, with little social mobility. You were largely born into your station in life, and it was very difficult to move up the social ladder. Peasants were bound to the land and owed service to their lord. The nobility held power and privilege. The clergy had significant influence. This rigid social structure dictated almost every aspect of a person's life, from what they ate to what kind of work they did. Let's float over to the topic of medieval homes. As mentioned earlier, most people lived in simple dwellings, often just one or two rooms made of wattle and daub, woven sticks covered in mud, with thatched roofs. These homes offered little protection from the elements, were poorly ventilated, and were prone to fires. Privacy was virtually non-existent. Imagine your entire family living, eating, and sleeping in a single room. Personal space was not a concept that medieval peasants had the luxury of contemplating. And what about the long, dark medieval nights? Once the sun went down, light was scarce and expensive. Candles were a luxury, and most people relied on the dim glow of a fire. This limited nighttime activities and contributed to long hours of sleep, which, to be fair, they probably desperately needed after a day of hard labor. But imagine the fear of the unknown that lurked in the darkness, with no streetlights and the constant threat of robbers or wild animals. Let's not forget the role of superstition in medieval life. With limited scientific understanding, people often turned to folklore and superstition to explain the world around them. Belief in witchcraft, magic, and various mythical creatures was widespread. These beliefs could have real-world consequences, leading to witch hunts and other forms of persecution. It's a stark reminder of the dangers of ignorance and fear. And speaking of fear, the concept of death was ever present in medieval life. With high mortality rates, people were constantly confronted with death, both their own and that of their loved ones. Religious beliefs offered solace and a framework for understanding death. But the practical realities of it, the pain, the loss, the lack of effective medical care, must have been a heavy burden. Funerals were important social and religious rituals, marking the passage from this life to the next. Let's briefly touch upon the relationship between humans and animals in the Middle Ages. Animals played a crucial role in agriculture, transportation, and even warfare. They were a vital part of daily life. However, the treatment of animals could often be harsh, reflecting the general struggle for survival. Pets existed, but they were more likely to be working animals that also provided companionship rather than purely domestic creatures like we have today. And what about leisure activities? While life was mostly hard work, people did find ways to relax and socialize. Community gatherings, religious festivals, and storytelling were important forms of entertainment. Games and sports existed, though they were often rough and ready. Music and dance were also popular. These moments of respite must have been crucial in the face of the daily hardships of medieval life. Let's consider the differences between rural and urban life in the Middle Ages. While the majority of the population lived in rural agricultural communities, towns and cities were growing in importance. Urban life offered different opportunities, such as trade and craftsmanship, but it also came with its own set of challenges, including overcrowding, poor sanitation, and the spread of disease. Think of medieval cities as densely packed hubs of both commerce and squalor. And finally, let's reflect on the overall mindset of people living in medieval times. Life was often short, hard, and unpredictable. Survival was the primary goal. Their worldview was shaped by their religious beliefs, their social status, and the limited knowledge available to them. They lived in a world where the natural environment could be both a source of sustenance and a constant threat. It's a world vastly different from our own, and one that, while sometimes romanticized, was filled with daily challenges that most of us would find incredibly difficult to endure. So as you drift off to sleep in your comfortable, climate-controlled home, with clean water and readily available food, maybe take a moment to appreciate just how much things have changed. Sweet dreams, and try not to dream of fleas.